Mackinac Island is arguably the most famous vacation spot in Michigan and has been for quite some time. Its location in Lake Huron between the Upper and Lower Peninsula, with views of the Mackinac Bridge and both the sunset and sunrise over the Great Lakes, is unparalleled. Not to mention there's a 5-star hotel there called the Grand Hotel that was immortalized in the 1980 Christopher Reeve film Somewhere in Time. And as far as culinary traditions go, the island is known for its fudge. But if you look into the history of Mackinac Island, it is much more interesting than just a vacation spot, movie location, and fudge factory. Native Americans have been coming here for over 1,000 years and consider it a sacred place, where tribes would meet and revel in the nature that the Great Spirit granted them, and many Native American chiefs and indigenous folks were buried here. Some have been buried near the lake as that was common in Native American practice, and bones have been found after buildings have been bulldozed and built upon, while others may have been buried at a place called Skull Cave, more towards the center of the island. The Anishinaabe also believed that this was the first land to appear after the glaciers melted from the Ice Age, or what is known in indigenous tradition as the Great Flood. They thought that Mackinac Island was a mythical turtle peering out of Lake Huron due to the turtle shape of the island. They also believed that the island was home to many divine spirits, and in some reports, they even thought that a tall structure called Sugarloaf Rock was the dwelling of Gitche Manitou, the great spirit that flows through all life and nature. And according to oral histories passed down through generations, indigenous tribes met here when they first came to the area now known as the Great Lakes, and they held a grand council on Mackinac Island to decide the regions of the Great Lakes that each tribe would call home. But there's a misconception as to how Mackinac Island got its name. Most American history tellings of how the island got its name. Mishi and Mackinac translates to big turtle when combined in the Chippewa language. Mishi means tremendous in size, and Mackinac is the Chippewa and Ojibwe name for the mud turtle. So naturally, people thought indigenous tribes combined these two words and called the island Michilimackinac. And this is all true, but there's more to this story. According to Andrew Blackbird in the 1887 book History of the Ottawa and Chippewa Tribes of Michigan, Blackbird said a small group of Native Americans lived on Mackinac Island before the Ottawa and Chippewa tribes started coming here. The small tribe of indigenous people were apparently massacred in the dead of winter by the Seneca tribe of the Iroquois family, who lived in the modern-day state of New York. They were most likely massacred because the Seneca tribe wanted control of the island and the Mackinac Straits due to its tremendous resources. According to tradition, 2 lovers from the small tribe attacked by the Iroquois escaped during the slaughter, put on snowshoes and inverted them so it would look as if their tracks were going towards Mackinac Island and not away from it. And then they proceeded to walk all the way to Ottawa Island, or modern-day Manitoulin Island on Lake Huron, and lived to tell the story to the Ottawa tribe. The Ottawas and Chippewas then named this island Michilimackinac in memorial of the small tribe that once lived on Mackinac Island. The 2 lovers, spurned by the slaughter of their people, would then isolate themselves and live in wild country around the Great Lakes and would go on to have 10 boys. According to Andrew Blackbird, this is the earliest known history of settlers on Mackinac Island. He says that this most likely happened in the 12th or 13th century, but it is known by archaeologists that people have been fishing and hunting on Mackinac Island since at least 900 AD. There were several French missions to the island in the 1600s to preach Catholicism to indigenous people, including a mission by Jacques Marquette, who founded the first European settlement in Michigan at nearby Sault Ste. Marie. Marquette and a man named Louis Joliet discovered the island by canoeing up the Mississippi River and then into the Illinois River that leads into Lake Michigan. Eventually, the French would rename the island Michilimackinac, and the British, who took over much of the island in 1761 during the 7 Years' War, took over the fort and shortened the European naming to Mackinac. But in this 2-part Tales of the Great Lakes, we are going to specifically focus on the sunrise side of Mackinac Island, an area called Mission Point after a Presbyterian missionary named William Montague Ferry was sent to the island to preach Protestantism and start a Native American boarding school. Mission Point Resort was built by a group called Moral Rearmament in the 1950s, and many perceive this group to be a cult, including actress Glenn Close, who grew up in the Moral Rearmament movement, but not on Mackinac Island. The head of Moral Rearmament at the time this property was developed was Frank Bookman. Bookman was a Christian nationalist who believed that 4 tenets: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love could morally rearm the world. Although if you talk to members of the MRA, they tell you that all the MRA wanted was world peace, and they aren't a cult at all. And there is still debate today on if they were actually a cult or just a harmless movement. A writer and MRA leader named Peter Howard had the idea of starting a college on the MRA's Mackinac Island property, and so Mackinac College began in 1966. This is also where a ghost story on Mission Point originates, and until I made this two-part video, the real identity of the person behind this ghost story has not been publicly known. Many who know about the haunting of the Mission Point Resort like to call this ghost Harvey, and say he was a kid who went to Mackinac College and jumped off a limestone bluff called Robinson's Folly, next to the resort due to an unrequited love. Both parts of the story are wrong, but I did find a real story in an old newspaper clipping of a kid who unalived himself on the island while attending Mackinac College. Harvey is not his real name, and the real person behind this ghost story actually has quite a colorful history. So in the second part of this video, I will reveal his real name and part of his story, so stay tuned for that. But for the first part of this video, I wanted to focus on the early history of Mission Point on Mackinac Island. It seems to be a common ritual around Michigan and on the island to discuss the more fun ghost stories of Mackinac Island, but most don't want to delve into the darker parts of its history. For example, much of the day-to-day history about the Native American boarding school on the Mission Point side of the island has not been kept. But as more has been publicly revealed about Native American boarding schools all over the country, there's no doubt that was probably not a fun and wholesome place for children to be educated. So without further ado, I present to you the dark history of Mission Point on Mackinac Island. The first European human history of the Mission Point side of Mackinac Island starts when the British had control of the island and Fort Mackinac still employed British soldiers. The British had taken Fort Michilimackinac from the French in 1761 during the 7 Years' War, and Mackinac Island was officially part of the province of Quebec at this time. The Mission Point side of the island has a 127-foot limestone cliff, the same cliff that towers over Mission Point Resort today, and is falsely attributed to where Harvey the Ghost spent his last waking moments. That cliff today is called Robinson's Folly. It was here that a captain in the British military named Daniel Robertson allegedly built a house in his time at Fort Mackinac between 1782 and 1787. Now, there are two stories as to how Robinson's Folly got its name. One story says that Daniel Robertson built a house on this cliff overlooking Lake Huron, and one day, part of this cliff fell and his house fell along with it. The other story says that Daniel Robinson was in love with a local Native American woman, and a Native American man then fought him for the hand of the woman, and the two men, plus the woman, wrestled themselves off the cliff, and this is all a tall tale though, as there's proof that Daniel Robinson lived until 1810 and passed away in Montreal at 77 years old. As for the story of Robertson's house, this has also never been proven to this day. Years later, in 1823, after the British had left, a man named William Montague Ferry and his wife Amanda were sent to Mackinac Island on a mission. And that mission was to spread Presbyterianism to the Native Americans and new American residents of Mackinac Island. Ferry was from Granby, Massachusetts, and ended up being ordained at New Brunswick Seminary in New Jersey. It was a common practice for newly ordained ministers to do missionary work for the United Foreign Missionary Board. Native American boarding schools were being set up all around the country at this point, as Anglo-Americans were lusting for land and resources in this new country, and Michigan was looked at as the unincorporated western part of the United States, as it wasn't yet a state. Fur and lumber were plentiful in Michigan, and the fur trade was still booming in the 1820s because fur hats were quite fashionable back in Europe. But there was one thing standing in the way of having a monopoly on using the land and its animals to attain capital, and that was, of course, the Native Americans who already lived here. It's common knowledge that Anglo-Americans genocided these indigenous people, but what is less talked about is the Native American boarding schools indigenous children attended after they were already subjugated to slaughter and sickness. Many kids were forced to go to these boarding schools where Anglo-Americans would teach them their culture, the English language, and usually a form of Christian religion. In some schools, they would even beat the children if they spoke their native language and not English. They were essentially setting up the next generation of Native Americans to be assimilated to the ways of Anglo-Americans. Part of this was due to eugenics and the belief that Native Americans were an inferior race and that their culture needed to be brainwashed out of them, but it was also so that they wouldn't rise up against Anglo-Americans and demand their land back after white Americans used their enhanced weaponry to slaughter them and then force them to sign unfair treaties with the looming threat of more war. The children at these schools were even forced to cut their hair while here, and due to them being forced to speak English, it's the reason some native languages have been lost and are not spoken today. Much of what went on at these boarding schools has been kept silent, and many records have been destroyed. Most speculate this was due to the abuse of the children. Mass grave sites have been found next to some of these schools, and some of the children have reported being sexually abused by the priests and pastors, as these boarding schools often were led by a church. Sadly, Mission House Boarding School is one of these schools where much of the day-to-day history has not been kept, so we will never truly know what went on at Mission House. As previously mentioned, Mackinac Island was long a sacred place to Native Americans, and although the British actually maintained control of the island during most of the War of 1812, including when the British and Native Americans defeated Americans in the 1814 Battle of Mackinac Island, the British ended up deserting it in 1815 when that war was over. The island then turned into a small community of American settlers looking to build a new home away from the hustle and bustle of more populous cities like New York City and Boston. And these settlers would trade things such as fur with the Native Americans. The American Fur Company's northern department set up shop here. Reverend William Montague Ferry from Massachusetts chose the Sunrise side of the island to settle at after he was sent here on his mission to preach Protestantism, hence why Americans ended up calling it Mission Point. 2 years after Ferry and his wife Amanda came here, a carpenter named Martin Haydenburg led a crew of builders to help construct William Ferry a boarding school for Native Americans in 1825. It was originally a two-story white building with the timber coming from nearby Mill Creek. Although there weren't many records kept of exactly what was going on at the school, according to Mackinac Island historians, 16 children passed away while attending Mission House. Historians say that there may have been a tuberculosis outbreak at the school, and instead of sending the indigenous children away to get treatment, the heads of the school would bring the Native American children down to the basement of Mission House, so they thought the cool air in the basement would help treat the tuberculosis. This obviously would have made their sickness worse and most likely contributed to their passing. And that may be why today, the employees that stay at Mission House over the summer have reported hearing children in the hallways, and even seeing child's handprints on the windows of the building. There's also an unspoken rule amongst many of the summer employees to not walk around alone in Mission House at night, for fear of what happens in the hallways in the midnight hours. Even those that don't believe in ghosts have reported an eerie feeling while walking around the former boarding school. William and Amanda did produce a child of their own, though. On June 10, 1827, Amanda Ferry gave birth to Thomas Ferry at Mission House. Remember this name as he would become a prominent figure in Michigan and Mackinac Island history. In the winter of 1829 to 1830, Martin Haydenburg and a crew built Mission Church nearby Mission House, and William Ferry would now have a pulpit to preach at. Mission Church is still the oldest surviving church building in Michigan today. It was built in the New England colonial style, as that is where Ferry was from, and after this was built, the Catholic St. Anne Church on the island installed a full-time priest, and so began the Catholic and Protestant rivalry on Mackinac Island. This rivalry still stands as Protestants and Catholics are buried in separate cemeteries on the island up to this day. People that are prominent in Michigan and Mackinac Island history attended Mission Church, such as American Fur Company trader Robert Stewart, and also ethnographer and geographer Henry Schoolcraft, along with his wife Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, who was part Ojibwe. Henry Schoolcraft wrote much of the early history of Mackinac Island, but most historians believe Jane Schoolcraft provided him the indigenous history, as she was part Ojibwe and knew of many of the stories passed down in her tribe. Henry Schoolcraft was also the U.S. Indian agent for Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and was appointed to that position in 1822 by Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass, after they had both traveled throughout the whole Great Lakes region and over to the Mississippi River, where both Schoolcraft and Cass were led by an Ojibwe guide named Ozawindip. This guide allowed Schoolcraft and Cass to become the first Anglo-Americans to discover the source of the Mississippi River, which is Lake Itasca in Minnesota. Indian agents such as Schoolcraft served as a sort of arbitrator and deal maker between the Native American tribes and Anglo-Americans, although they rarely ever gave Native American tribes a fair deal in terms of land treaties. And this would be the case for the Anishinaabe people in the area when Henry Schoolcraft brokered the 1836 Treaty of Washington with the United States and the Ottawa and Chippewa nations. One interesting fact about this treaty, the leaders of the Ottawa and Chippewa nations actually traveled by canoe from northern Michigan all the way down to Washington, D.C. to sign it. They'd use waterways and tributaries and paddled for weeks on end because if they weren't there to sign the treaty, the Americans might have given them an even worse deal than the one that they ended up signing. This deal saw the Anishinaabe tribes yield nearly 14 million acres of land in the northwestern part of the Lower Peninsula and the eastern part of the Upper Peninsula. In return, the tribes would receive permanent reservation lands and perpetual access to natural resources, including hunting and fishing rights. The United States agreed to pay for the land and provide additional services, including use of a dormitory constructed on Mackinac Island. This dormitory would be where Native Americans could stay at when they wanted to come to the island, but most chose to camp on the beaches at Lake Huron instead. Eventually that dorm would be refashioned into the Richard and Jane Manoogian Mackinac Art Museum. You might ask why Native Americans would agree to such a treaty. Well, the Anishinaabe tribes fought on the side of the British in the War of 1812, as they could see the dismal tide of America coming. The Anishinaabe hoped that if the British defeated the United States, maybe they would be able to maintain some of their land. But after the British decided that the United States wasn't worth fighting for anymore, they signed a treaty and ended their battle with the Americans and left the area after many Native Americans had already fought and died in the war. And then in 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which resulted in the Trail of Tears, and many indigenous people south of the Great Lakes dying and being forcibly removed west of the Mississippi River to reservations in Kansas and modern-day Oklahoma. So it seemed like the best option available for the Anishinaabe tribes to sign a treaty, make some money, and maintain some of their land instead of being forcibly removed, losing all of their land forever. But as an example of how the US government treated Native Americans horribly, immediately after representatives of the Anishinaabe tribes navigated waterways in birch bark canoes all the way to Washington, D.C., signed the Treaty of Washington, and paddled back home to the Great Lakes, Congress altered the terms of the treaty and instead made it so it was only effective for 5 years before the government could forcibly remove the Native Americans from the area. Coincidentally, this land officially made Michigan a big enough state so that the US government could admit them into the Union, and 1 year later, in 1837, that is exactly what would happen. Then in 1838, Schoolcraft himself would call for Native American removal from the area, only 2 years after the treaty was signed and 3 years before the shortened treaty was set to retire. But back to Mission Point. By 1834, it was quite evident that Mission School could not fund itself financially, so Robert Stewart from the American Fur Company paid for Reverend William Ferry and his wife to relocate to the Grand River in modern-day Grand Haven, Michigan. And this is where William Ferry would preach and live until he died in 1867, with his wife Amanda dying 3 years later. Mission School would close by 1837, the same year Michigan became a state, and the building would be turned into a hotel in 1849 by a man named Edward Franks. Franks would add a third story to the building, and that is how it would look all the way up to today in 2025. Thomas Ferry, William Ferry's son, would end up becoming a Republican U.S. Senator in 1871, 4 years after his father passed. Thomas worked his way up in local politics, including the Michigan House of Representatives and Senate, before he was elected to the U.S. House on March 4, 1865, a month before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Ferry was a Republican, but most likely not a progressive Republican, as it seemed he started out his tenure in the House as being pro-Andrew Johnson, the Southern Democrat who wanted to compromise and bargain with the South after the Civil War and after Lincoln's assassination. Thomas Ferry attended a Loyalist convention in 1866 in favor of Andrew Johnson before turning on Johnson and testifying in his impeachment in 1868 and voting to impeach him. When he became a U.S. Senator in 1871, Ulysses S. Grant was president, and Ferry eventually rose to the lofty senatorial position of President pro tempore, who's in charge of residing over the Senate when the Vice President isn't there. And in November of 1875, Vice President Henry Wilson suffered a stroke and passed away, which made Thomas Ferry the acting Vice President of the United States and first in line for presidential succession, as this was before the Presidential Succession Act of 1947, and the Speaker of the House was not yet above the President pro tempore, in line for presidential succession. At the same time, Mackinac Island was becoming a very popular tourist destination within Michigan. After the Civil War and at the start of the Gilded Age, there were many rich industrialists who were making loads of money, and vacationing was becoming popular due to the first transcontinental railroad being completed in 1869, which connected the East Coast to the West Coast. With this westward expansion, surveyors really started to document the magnificent wonders of all the areas outside the East Coast and the South. And Yellowstone National Park became the first national park in the United States in 1872, withdrawing the land from public auction and preserving it for its natural beauty. And the second national park in the country was signed into law in 1875, and that would be none other than Michigan's own Mackinac Island. Senator Thomas Ferry, born in Mission House and son of the Ferry family that once were missionaries at Mission Point, lobbied for Michigan's Great Turtle Island to have a little more than 50% of its land preserved and saved from development. As previously mentioned, Ferry was the president pro tempore at the time, so his words carried some weight and spoke to the ear of the president. So Ulysses S. Grant signed Mackinac Island National Park into law on March 3, 1875. Around when Mackinac Island became a national park, in the 1870s and 1880s, a Michigan industrialist and politician named Alanson Sheely built 2 cottages at the far eastern end of Mission Point. They were in the Gothic Revival style of architecture and would be named Cedar Point and Small Point Cottage. Sheely had previously served in the Michigan Senate as a Republican. These 2 cottages would later be explored on a ghost hunting episode on Expedition X on the Discovery Channel. During the 1880s, there was a growing notion in the U.S. federal government that instead of keeping Native Americans on reservations, the U.S. should force indigenous people to assimilate even more to white Anglo-Saxon culture by breaking up reservations and pushing Native Americans to become farmers with individual plots of land. And this resulted in the Dawes Act of 1887. Quote, it was reasoned that if a person adopted white clothing and ways and was responsible for their own farm, they would gradually drop their Indianness and be assimilated into white American culture, unquote. Of course, this resulted in even more reservation land being confiscated by the federal government so that the reservations that were created with the Treaty of Washington in 1836 became even smaller. Some of the previous reservation land was opened up for sale to white Americans, and this caused widespread poverty amongst the Native Americans in the Upper Great Lakes region and across the country, including some of the indigenous folks that attended the Mission Point School on Mackinac Island and their kids and grandkids. Eventually, the federal government saw no need for Fort Mackinac to continue, as threats of the British in the South subsided, and they thought that Fort Mackinac was a use of tax dollars that could be spent elsewhere. There was no National Park Service yet, so most of the national parks at this time were maintained by the military, and with the military leaving, federal agents gave Mackinac Island National Park over to the state of Michigan, and it was then officially designated as the first state park of Michigan. 1 year after Mackinac Island became a state park, Thomas Ferry would pass away at 8 a.m. on October 14, 1896, from a stroke of apoplexy. Ferry was once a lumber millionaire, as he was an early investor in Michigan's lumber industry, but he lost much of his money in an 1882 election where a man named J. Hubble spread libelous claims throughout Michigan while running against him for his Senate seat. Ferry spent large sums of money combating these libel claims and going after Hubble. Eventually, Hubble would back off and drop out of the race, but the rumors still persisted around the caddy halls of D.C. And Ferry then withdrew from running for a 3rd term in the Senate. He passed away broke and single with no children and is now buried in Grand Haven's Lake Forest Cemetery. As for Mission House, it would stay as a hotel owned and ran by the Franks family until 1939, nearly 90 years after Edward Franks first bought the property. Mission Point was often thought of as the quiet part of the island, further away from the touristy downtown area and the luscious Grand Hotel. Mackinac Island really grew into what it is today in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but the Sunrise side of the island was about to become a little less quiet, as an alleged cult would soon set its sights on developing Mission Point into their North American headquarters. And that's where I'll leave you for this episode, so go take a break, grab a Faygo, and click the next Tales of the Great Lakes when you're ready for more dark history of Mission Point on Mackinac Island.